of the University of Oxford. She's conducting a project investigating accountability for Operation Condor transnational crimes in South America, funded by the European Commission. She's the author of a number of books. I will not name them all because it'll take a long time. She's extraordinarily prolific. She's also an international consultant for the Observatorio Luz Ibarburo in Uruguay and an affiliate member of the Latin American Transitional Justice Network. And to my left, a man who needs no introduction, nevertheless, John Dinges, a distinguished journalist. In the 1970s and 80s, he was a correspondent for the Washington Post in Chile and Central America. He was in Chile during the 1973 coup against Allende, and he was one of the only, I think, American journalists to remain in Chile for several years after the coup. He later became the managing editor for NPR, and he is currently an emeritus professor of journalism at Columbia University. He is the author of The Condor Years, published by the New Press, with an expanded new edition coming out next year. So without any further delay, I'm going to turn the putative mic over to Francesca, who will talk for about 30-35 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. Good morning. I have to stand here to manage the PowerPoint, but that's usually normal for me because if I sit down or sometimes I'm standing behind the readers, people don't actually see me, so I guess that resolves that problem. Well, I'm really happy to be here today to be sharing some of my research here at the Washington office on Latin America. I'm very grateful for the invitation from Jo Marie to be here, and of course honored to be sharing the panel with John Dinges, who's one of the most renowned experts on Operation Condor. So what I wanted to share with you today are some insights from a new research project, or relatively new research project that I've been conducting over the past couple of years, which focuses on mapping Operation Condor atrocities, but also accountability efforts that have been taking place over the past 2 decades in trying to achieve some form of justice for the crimes that Operation Condor committed in the 1970s and 80s. As most of you are probably aware, Operation Condor is the code name that was given to a continent-wide covert operation established by South America's dictatorships in the mid and late 1970s to eliminate hundreds of left-wing politicians, militants, and activists all across the region. So for my talk today, I would like to do 4 things. First, begin by sharing an emblematic case of Operation Condor. There have been hundreds of cases of victims of Operation Condor, and so I thought that a good way to introduce to you to Operation Condor would be by an emblematic case that shows us how Operation Condor worked all across the region. Secondly, I wanted to share with you some really preliminary insights from a new database on Operation Condor victims that I've been building since last year. And then third, to give you a brief overview of the different criminal investigations that have been happening in South America and beyond, that have been trying to shed light on the atrocities committed by Operation Condor. And then finally, to look in some detail at 2 specific criminal prosecutions that were recently concluded in Argentina and in Italy, that also help us generate some reflections about the role of what I call justice entrepreneurs. So to start, I wanted to share with you the story of a Uruguayan family that was living in exile in Argentina. As you can see on the slide, the family was composed by Mario, Roger, Julien, Victoria Grisonas, and their 2 little children, Anatole and Victoria. They had moved to Argentina in early 1975 because both Mario and Victoria had been suffering political persecution in their native Uruguay. So, similarly to many other Uruguayans, but also Bolivians, Chileans, and Paraguayans, Argentina became a sort of refuge country for many of the political activists that were being persecuted by the dictatorships in their native country. In mid-1975, Victoria and Mario took part in the founding of the Party for the Victory of the People, a party that was established in Buenos Aires by a large community of Uruguayan exiles that were living there as a consequence of suffering political persecution in their native Uruguay. On September 26, 1976, the house where the family was living in San Martin in the province of Buenos Aires was attacked by a military operation conducted by the Argentine army together with Uruguayan officials. Neighbors remember that it felt like a war zone that day, even war tanks being used in attacking the house where the family lived. When I interviewed Anatole in 2013, he told me that he still had sort of flashbacks and images from that day when his house got attacked. Of course, he remembered men in military uniforms, but he also recalled how his mother, himself, and his little sister, that was just 1.5 years old, were hiding in the bathtub in the house as a way of getting sheltered from the attack. The father died during the operation. It's unclear whether he perished being attacked or he decided to take his own life. Victoria, and together with her two little children, were taken to Automotores Sorvetti, you see the main entrance up there, which in late 1976 was one of the main detention centers connected to Operation Condor in Buenos Aires. Survivors of that detention center remember seeing the family there. Victoria remains disappeared to date, and this was the beginning of a very long ordeal for the two little children. In early October 1976, several flights took Uruguayan prisoners that were detained in Orleti back to their native Uruguay. And as part of one of these flights, also the two little children were taken to Montevideo, to this building here, which was the building of the Defense Information Service, where a clandestine detention center was also operating in the basement. The Uruguayan survivors of Operation Condor were being detained there, and they recall that at some point they could hear little children running and playing on the upstairs rooms from where they were. And this coincides with the timeline that the judiciary has been able to establish with this case. So after being detained in Argentina, taken to Uruguay and spending some time there, Anatole and Victoria were taken to Chile. Anatole also remembers that when he was in a small plane, and he remembers also seeing the Andes. He had never seen the mountains before, so that image that he has was still very powerful in his memory. They were taken to Valparaiso and abandoned in one of the city's biggest squares called O'Higgins Square. Luckily for them, some of the people that were working around the square noticed these two little children throughout the day and started realizing that nobody were picking them up. And so they called the police that notified the family court, and they were initially sent to an orphanage until the family court could identify a suitable family to adopt them. Of course, Anatole was 4.5 years old, so he was actually able to speak and communicate, and everybody in Chile noticed that these two little children had a totally different accent to what they were used to. And this probably was a useful element in the future as I end this story. When Anatole and Victoria were in the orphanage, Anatole remembers that he was very attached to his sister, and because he remembered who he was and his sister's names, he wouldn't allow anybody to change their names or to call them any other way, as a sort of way to hang on to their identity. That was the only thing these two children had. In 1977, the judge authorized the adoption of Anatole and Victoria to the family of Jesus Larrabeiti Llanes and his wife, that was actually the only family willing to adopt both of the brothers. Unlike other families, they only wanted one of them, and the judge was unwilling to separate the two because of this close connection. They lived with the family for about 2 years until in 1979, Anatole and Victoria, they became the first case of children whose identity was recovered through the work of the grandmothers of May Square. By a situation of luck, a social worker that I worked with them in the orphanage in Valparaiso saw a photo later on in human rights documents and paperwork, and she realized that the two children that she had seen in Valparaiso in 1977 were exactly those same children whose grandmother was looking for them in Uruguay. And so she made the connection with the family grandmother in Uruguay, and the grandmother traveled to Chile to identify the children. And of course, as you can imagine, she wanted to take the grandchildren back to Uruguay with her, but psychologists that worked with the family, they recommended that it would have been extremely devastating for the two children to be separated from their second adoptive family, and especially for Anatole, because he had clear memories of losing his first family already. And so the psychologists recommended for the children to stay in Chile and to visit regularly Uruguay so they could still develop a family connections with their own family. And that's how Anatole and Victoria stayed on in Chile and then became also activists in justice both in Chile and in Uruguay as well. So I wanted to begin my talk with this case because I think it's very illustrative of the dynamics of terror that Operation Condor established across the region. As we can see with this story, we have people moving easily across borders, spending time at different detention centers from Argentina to Uruguay to be ultimately abandoned in Chile, a third country from where this story even began. So I think it's a really powerful example of how Operation Condor allowed for the creation of a borderless area of terror and impunity throughout South America. So moving on to the second part of my talk, I wanted to share some really preliminary findings. This is a sort of a sub-part of my project that I started working on just last year, which relates to the creation of a database on Operation Condor victims. And the idea behind this database comes from a couple of workshops that I organized together with colleagues from Chile and Uruguay in Santiago and Montevideo in 2015 and 2016. And during these workshops, we brought together human rights activists, survivors, lawyers, judges, and prosecutors who had all been involved in the investigation of these crimes in one way or the other. And one of the issues that they raised during the workshop was the fact that many times it was difficult to really identify properly cases of Operation Condor. In the case of Argentina, initially, for example, they treated all foreign victims of disappearances as victims of Operation Condor. But then once you started digging into the details of the specific case, you would find that the person had left, let's say, native Uruguay, but then had joined a local Argentine political group, and they were ultimately disappeared because of that and not because of their original connection to the country. And so basically, with the discussions that we carried out during these workshops, we thought that being a foreigner was not enough to consider being a case of Operation Condor, but there had to be an additional element, which was a crossing of borders. And we thought that the crossing of borders could take place in different ways, either because the country where the person was detained requested information from the countries of origin of the victim, or because foreign agents would travel to the country where the victim was found to take part in an operation to detain and disappear the person, or, as we've seen in the case of the two children, the victims themselves would be moved across different countries and ultimately back to their country of origin for disappearance. And so We tried to get funding to get this created. We haven't so far, so I decided to start building the database as part of my research. And I think it's turning out to be a really interesting experience because the database confirms much of the existing knowledge that we have about Operation Condor, but also provides some new insights or maybe just some nuances that were not as clear as before. So I wanted to share some of the preliminary findings, and just to start, just to give you an idea of the breadth and the scope of Operation Condor as truly a transnational enterprise of terror. I marked on the map some of the locations where Operation Condor crimes were committed, and of course not forgetting some crimes in Europe and also in Washington here, as with the case of the Letelier murder in 1976. So if we look at the victims by nationality, I'm sorry, it's a bit small, but I'll read out some of the key numbers. In this specific case, the database confirms some of the knowledge of Operation Condor. We have the highest number of victims being Uruguayans, with 189 cases so far. And I should say that I'm still building this, so I mean it may change, but this is what I've been able to do so far. So 189 cases from Uruguay that amount to 55% of the total that I have so far, followed by 71 cases of Argentine victims of Condor, 20%, 47 victims from Chile, amounting to 14%, and then 22 victims from Paraguay, amounting to 6%. And I think what this pie chart shows quite clearly is that Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay were indeed the most enthusiastic members of Condor, which we know from some of the US declassified archival documents that point exactly to this protagonist role of these three countries. Moving on, 345. 345, and I have 33 that I'm still trying to gather more information. So moving on to the country of commission of crime. Again, I think here the database confirms that Argentina, being the place where all the exiles had fled throughout the 60s and 70s, really became the hunting ground for Operation Condor atrocities. I recorded 277 cases in Argentina that amount to 80% of the total. But I think the database also points to two interesting things relating to Uruguay and especially Brazil. Brazil shows here as the third country by commission of crime, which I think is a really interesting element because there has been a tendency on the part of Brazil to try to gloss over their role within Operation Condor, saying that they were just observer in the beginning and then they signed up reluctantly to this plan, but actually we have at least 10 cases of Operation Condor conducted on Brazilian territory, which put Brazil in a sort of third place, so sort of questioning this sort of self-image of Brazil as really having just a secondary role on Operation Condor. Moving on to the type of crime, again, here I think the information from the database confirms that Operation Condor basically transnationalized the modus operandi of state terrorism to the regional level. We see a really high number of detention, followed by torture, and then by disappearance. And these two crimes combined amount to over 80% of the types of crimes committed by Operation Condor that does reflect practices of state terror inside Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay as well, and Paraguay. Moving on to the background of the victims of Operation Condor, here I think the database both confirms existing knowledge but also points to new elements. So on the one hand, we see that 23% of the victims were linked to armed groups. And this is normally the justification that South America's dictatorships use when talking about the need to coordinate their policies of repression as a way to counteract the fact that armed groups in South America were coordinating their actions against the dictatorships. But what then was interesting to me was that when I started adding up the other types of activism, the vast majority of the victims, so 54% of the victims, were actually militants from left-wing political parties, mainly from the PVP, which I mentioned in the beginning, the Party of Exiles, created in Argentina by Uruguayan exiles. Also traditional political parties, and then refugees under the protection of the High Commissioner for Refugees, and other militants from smaller political parties across the region. So I think here the database confirms one aspect of, yes, targeting armed groups, but actually there is a clear element that Operation Condor was directly targeting any form of opposition, whether it was armed opposition or political opposition, to the dictatorships from those groups that in exile were still trying to denounce the crimes of the dictatorship and to discredit what these illegal governments were doing across the region. Finally, the last slide from this section relates to how many of the cases of Operation Condor victims have had some sort of investigation by the judiciary. And I think it's quite interesting to see how there has been a high level of judicialization of these cases. About almost 50% of the cases already have a verdict, usually in first instance, by courts in either Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, or Italy. And another 26% of cases are currently being investigated or are being or are in a trial phase at the moment. So I wanted to move on now to just give you a quick panorama of accountability efforts that have been unfolding over the past few decades in trying to shed lights onto the transnational crimes of Operation Condor. And I would like to highlight one of these moments that to me is really powerful because it happened at the same time as Operation Condor was operating in 1977. The photo, which I hope you can see sort of on the screen here, is a photo of Automotore Sorletti from early 1977. And the photo was taken by a Uruguayan survivor, a Uruguayan journalist, who had been detained in Orleti in 1976, taken to Montevideo, and ultimately freed. Once he got released from jail, he traveled back to Argentina, as you can imagine, at the height of the dictatorship there, at the height of Operation Condor. He managed to get in touch with the local network of Uruguayan exiles, and because there had been rumors about this site that by now was no longer functioning as a detention center because two prisoners had managed to escape, they were able to retrace their steps, and because just in front of Orleti there is a train line, he managed to take this photo from the train as he passed through the city. And he took this photo together with other evidence and his own testimony to Amnesty International in London, where in March 1977, Uruguayan Enrique Rodriguez Larreta gave a powerful testimony about what he had to live through together with other 20 Uruguayans that had shared the same ordeal with him. Of course, the testimony of Enrique Rodriguez Larreta, the father, because there's also Enrique Rodriguez's son. Yeah. So the testimony of survivors was also crucial for the Argentine CONADEP Truth Commission report, and also, of course, at the trial of the military commanders in 1985. I wanted to just give you a bit of an overview of the criminal investigations that I've been able to identify that look at different aspects of Operation Condor. And I've listed some of them here. I was able to identify 26 criminal investigations that are at different stages. So some of them have been completed, some are still ongoing, some are under appeal. And most of these investigations look at specific episodes or groups of victims of Operation Condor. But then two of them that I'm going to talk to you about in a little while actually try to tackle Operation Condor as a whole to really get to the modus operandi of this transnational terror network. I think it's interesting to point out how half of the trials, so 13 out of the 26 trials, took place in Uruguay. And of course, as I mentioned a little while ago, Uruguay has the highest group of victims, so it could be explained this way. But I think another interesting element relates to the fact that human rights activists and lawyers in Uruguay used Operation Condor atrocities in a strategic way to find loopholes in the impunity law that existed in the country. And because Operation Condor crimes had been partially committed outside of Uruguayan territories, lawyers could argue that the amnesty law was restricted to the national territory and it shouldn't be applied to those cases. And so there was a clear strategy to file Operation Condor cases before the courts as a way to start breaking the impunity that existed in Uruguay. So moving on, I'm aware of the time, so moving on quickly to the final part of my talk, I want to briefly discuss the Operation Condor trials that took place in Argentina and in Italy. These two trials originate from the 1990s, which was a decade of absolute impunity all across South America. We had no trials whatsoever in Chile and Uruguay. At the time, we had one trial in Chile for the Letelier murder, but that was the only trial that happened. In Argentina, there had been the trial of the commanders, followed by amnesties and pardons. And so in the 1990s, you only had truth trials and a few trials for the cases of baby kidnapping. So all the other types of crimes could not be investigated because of the existence of impunity laws. And so in this context, we see a really strong role by justice entrepreneurs, especially human rights activists and lawyers that tried to find ways around this wall of impunity that existed in the region at the time. And I was able to identify at least two strategies that these groups undertook. So first, as I was mentioning for Uruguay just now, a strategic litigation of crimes that allowed human rights activists to file cases falling outside the scope of the amnesty law and still allowing the courts to investigate the cases. And then the second strategy was to go abroad to Europe or to the US or to other countries to file cases there. And for South America, Italy and Spain were two obvious sort of locations where to file cases because many of the victims were sons and daughters of Italian and Spanish immigrants. And both countries allow for the prosecutions of crimes committed against their nationals overseas. So looking briefly at the Operation Condor trial in Argentina, this was an example of a strategic litigation of crime at home. As I was mentioning, in the 1990s, the context was one of very limited opportunities for justice. A group of two lawyers, Alberto Pedroncini and David Baygun, they worked very closely with human rights activists and families of victims. They filed in 1996 a case relating to the systematic plan of baby kidnapping, which was accepted by the courts and led to emblematic figures such as Videla and Macera being prosecuted once again, 10 years after their pardons. And the same group of lawyers then began working on the Operation Condor lawsuit. And in this case, they used strategically the crime of illegal kidnappings as a sort of interpreting disappearances as an ongoing crime that continued into the present. but also using the legal category of illicit association, which is similar to conspiracy in US and UK law, which is a particularly grave crime under the Argentine criminal code. And so they use this crime in the hope that the judges would not dismiss this case as easily as they did with other allegations of human rights violations. And in this case, there was a close collaboration between lawyers and victims, and they found sympathetic allies in prosecutors and judges that had to deal with this case. In particular, the judge requested extradition of several heads of states, including Pinochet and the head of Uruguayan armed forces. And although the context in the early 2000s was still much focused on impunity, when I interviewed the prosecutor, Miguel Ángel Osorio, he told me, we knew we couldn't do much, but we still wanted to gather evidence and gather proof because we could see things changing. So we wanted to gather all the material that could be useful later on when a new political opening would be in place. And so, sort of fast forwarding from 1999 to May 2006, the Operation Condor came to an end that year, with 15 defendants condemned and 2 acquitted. What was especially significant about this trial, of course there are many things I could tell you about, but for time reason I'll just keep it to one, is that the prosecution used the 100 cases of victims in this trial, not just for their own sake, but as a way to illustrate the pattern of crimes that Operation Condor committed all across the region. And indeed, the court, in the final sentence, recognizes that Operation Condor was a transnational illicit association that operated throughout South America. Moving on to finally to the example of a strategy by litigating cases overseas. This is the Operation Condor trial that has been taking place in Italy recently, but its origins are to be traced back to Uruguay again. 1990s, not a single trial for past human rights violations. So many of the victims and also many of the relatives of victims told me that they felt that they had no choice but to go elsewhere to look for justice because they just couldn't see any opening happening in their own country yet. And so with the precedent of the detention of Pinochet in London in 1998, with support from Argentine counterparts, a small group of Uruguayan relatives filed in 1999 a case relating to 5 Uruguayan and 1 Argentine victims of Operation Condor that were of the Italian descent before the courts in Rome. And here, I think there are some interesting dynamics going on because we have not only a group of victims that gets organized in Uruguay and travels to Italy to present the case, but in Italy they work together with a group of South American exiles that had been living there for decades and that allowed them to make contact with local trade unions that were sympathetic to their cause, to left-wing political parties, and also a network of sympathetic human rights lawyers that were litigating these cases pro bono in most instances. And again, here there was also quite a long process lasting over 16 years. In January 2017, the court in Rome dictated a sentence handing down 8 life imprisonment and 19 acquittals. And on Thursday this week, there is actually the first hearing of the appeals phase in Rome. And hopefully some of these lawyers are aiming to reverse some of these acquittal sentences, especially the one of Jorge Trócoli, who is actually the only defendant that was being tried in person in Rome. And just finally, the very last slide, I promise. Just some preliminary reflections that I've been thinking about when looking at these 2 cases from the Argentine and Italian Operation Condor trial on the role of justice entrepreneurs and trying to understand the proactive and strategic and pioneering role that these activists have to take on in trying to look for opportunities for justice and create opportunities for justice when none seem to exist, and just sort of identifying some, probably this is not a complete list of course, but just some of the strategic actions that these justice entrepreneurs have undertaken, and how, I think, just to conclude, their work continues to be very much current and important, because even though I've been talking about lots of prosecutions and investigations, the possibility of a setback is always looming in the horizon. We've seen with the pardon to Fujimori, with discussions in Argentina of reducing sentences to some of the worst violators of human rights. So I think the discussion on justice entrepreneurs is still very much contemporary. Thank you very much. Thank you for the
So I want to thank Francesca for this really fascinating talk. And interestingly, I heard Francesca speak about Operation Condor at the International Studies Association meeting last week, and this was quite different. So you've illustrated new information, I think, in this presentation that I found absolutely fascinating. I just want to highlight two things. One is that your work, I think, is really important in highlighting the role of victims and their allies in the search for justice in Latin America. Your case demonstrates it. The cases in Peru, Guatemala, and other parts of Latin America have demonstrated this time and again. And their creativity, their persistence, their ability to find what is the creative ways around different obstacles that are placed in their way, I think is really important. And I think it's also really important that the fact that this is a case that is transnational, but you're focused on the way different actors have used courts outside of the region to push forward the justice agenda is fundamental. We see it in Peru, we see it in Guatemala. It's a constant in this search for justice. And so I just wanted to highlight those two things. I'm going to turn the mic over to John, who's going to give some brief remarks, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers.
Yeah, how are we doing for time?
Oh, we're good. We're good. You can speak for maybe 10 or 15.
Yeah, okay, like we were talking about. Okay, this is really satisfying for me to hear Francesca provide this incredibly systematic and academically rigorous investigation, following up on what I tried to do in the, well, really going back many decades as a journalist. I began the investigation of Operation Condor with a man named Robert Scherer, who was the FBI agent, the legal attaché in Buenos Aires at the time that Orlando Letelier was murdered here in Washington, D.C. And to the surprise of many leftist activists, I have to say, really there was a political dimension to it. The FBI took very seriously the murder here in Washington, D.C., even though Henry Kissinger was still Secretary of State, and the CIA and most of the State Department and certainly the U.S. military considered Chile to be one of our closest allies in Latin America. So to me, Operation Condor, which was one chapter in my first book on the assassination called Assassination on Embassy Row, Asesinato in Washington in the Spanish translation. It has always been this exemplary case of human rights violations in Latin America that have the dimension of the pursuit of justice. So not only was it it was, of course, not the largest operation the largest operations were in the individual countries where thousands and thousands of people were killed, tortured, and disappeared, particularly Chile, Argentina, to a lesser extent in Uruguay. But what Operation Condor did, the dimension that is unique to Operation Condor in the way I look at it, is that the international dimension, the fact that it crossed borders, gave impetus to investigations outside of these countries. As Francesca was pointing out about the Argentines in the 1990s, there wasn't much you could do at that time, but the gathering of evidence, which ultimately led to many, many prosecutions, and more importantly, perhaps, to my way of thinking, to establishing the truth of what happened. This began because the dictators crossed borders in a way that created evidence and the ability to investigate that was separate from the impunity protections that they had in their own countries. And the most important example of this, the absolute, I mean, way out of proportion example is the investigation that was begun by the FBI. It was the FBI that discovered, and I put that with a asterisk, discovered Operation Condor. I say discovered because it became public that Operation Condor existed as an alliance of dictators to assassinate people not only in Latin America, but outside of Latin America, in Europe and the United States. The asterisk is because, of course, the CIA already knew about Operation Condor. The State Department already knew about Operation Condor. Henry Kissinger and his top lieutenants in August, late July, and August and September, leading in the days up to the assassination here in Washington, were devoting considerable effort to reacting to the information, the intelligence they had received that Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay, and to a lesser extent the other Condor countries, were planning assassinations in Europe and were conducting assassinations within the Latin American countries. This record, which we now have, not completely, but we have a great deal of it through declassified documents, was essentially hidden from public view during the Letelier trial, which was in 1979. I only had hints of it, that there was more to this than what the FBI was able to tell me. And in the late 1990s, when Operation Condor really comes on to the public consciousness in a really big way and led to all of the trials and all of the research that Francesca was able to do, this was because Pinochet was arrested in London, and the Clinton administration decided, to the credit of Madeleine Albright, to declassify documents in a massive way at the initiative of the U.S. government, not at the initiative of those of us who over the years had been asking for documents through FOIA. And so the truth of this foreknowledge of the Condor operations became public for the first time and revealed an entirely new dimension of U.S., I'll say this carefully, complicity and a foreknowledge that had as its result a massive intelligence failure which allowed the Letelier murder to occur here in Washington, D.C. The thing that we have to focus on when we think about what the dictatorships were doing at this time, in the sense of analyzing Operation Condor, is that this was an alliance of entirely made up of close U.S. allies in the fight against communism and in the fight in the worldwide geopolitical struggle against the Soviet Union. These were our allies. These were universally supported militarily, diplomatically, and through public relations, public diplomacy campaigns throughout the period that we're talking about. These were U.S. allies, and yet this alliance, at least with the participation of Argentina, led by Chile, and with participation by another country, Paraguay, committed an assassination in Washington, D.C. In other words, our allies committed the first major act of international terrorism in the U.S. Capitol. That is what Operation Condor is all about. So it opened up the floodgates of information. Of course, it took 3 or 4 decades before we had the complete story. But if the FBI had not taken seriously its obligation to investigate and to pursue justice, I don't know where we would be at this point. We certainly would not be where we just saw described in terms of multiple cases in multiple countries with multiple defendants and people actually in prison. So Operation Condor is the human rights case that is most directly connected to international law and international justice. And in that sense, it resoundingly backfired on its perpetrators, and I think it's very important. I wanted to make a couple comments on Francesca's wonderful research, which I'm going to shamelessly lift for my updated version of my book, The Condor Years. And I'm sorry I was interrupting as you were, but I've got to sit down with Francesca. We got to go over all this data. But one of the most important things is the number of victims. It has been wildly exaggerated over the years. There was one book that came out of photography a couple years ago by a Brazilian photographer. I think he was Brazilian. Is he Brazilian? One? Or what? Oh, Portuguese, and maybe Portuguese, right. It was a wonderful book of photos called Condor, and it basically had shared my view of using Condor, not in terms of the actual victims of the actual operations, but as a symbol of the international dimension of all the human rights violations in the 1970s and early 80s. So I applaud that dimension because Condor is the apex, is the most egregious act of the dictatorships of the time. But the book, unfortunately, with no evidence, claimed that there were 60,000 victims of Condor. And of course, that is not even true if you add up all the victims of all the military governments in the Southern Cone at the time. So the issue of numbers, to me, is very important. And 345, I mean, we've talked about this before, but you have actually tracked down each one of those cases. I came up with an approximate number of 350. And so, and basically using the same base, but you did it much more systematically. So it's really important that we are on the same path in terms of documenting these cases. And that we, I think, are using the same criteria for what is an Operation Condor case. I would like to go through and look at each one of your cases. It's pretty much the same criteria I used in my book. It obviously was not enough that was somebody who was a foreigner who was arrested in another country, although that's where you start. The second element is that there was reason for, the way I analyzed it, right? There was reason for the intelligence or security forces of another country to be pursuing that person outside that person's borders, outside the borders of their own country. And that's the second element. So it wasn't enough that, for example, a Chilean in exile in Argentina was arrested and disappeared because they were working with the ERP or the Montoneros. That wasn't necessarily, a Condor case. Why do I say it wasn't necessarily a Condor case? In many, many cases, we don't know who actually did the arresting. In some of them we do. But in many of the cases, if that were the criteria, if we knew that there was an Uruguayan involved in arresting an Uruguayan in Argentina, or a Chilean involved in interrogating or arresting somebody in Argentina or another country, the number would be much smaller because we don't have that kind of evidence. But we do have evidence of the background of the victims, who they were working with at the time that they were arrested. And so my criterion, one of my basic criterion was anybody that was involved with the Junta Coordinadora Revolucionaria, which was the alliance of Tupamaros from Uruguay, ERP in Argentina, MIR in Chile, and ELN of Bolivia, that those four guerrilla organizations had created an alliance, and they were the initial target of Condor. So anybody that was documented as a member of the JCR, which is the abbreviation of that organization, I considered, unless there was other evidence to the contrary, that that was a Condor victim. And then, of course, any evidence of crossing borders. And that's important because in some cases, that's the only indication because there's not enough data about the militancy, the actual political activities. The only thing I think I disagree with in your analysis is the political activities of the victims. I think that the number of, but that's probably because I consider all of the people who are the Party for Victory members, I consider them to be members of an armed struggle organization, and I think you might have a different way of analyzing that. So that I would say that the immense majority of the victims were directly connected. In other words, were working with organizations involved in the armed struggle. So I'd like to look through your list and see where we come out on that. Okay. Well, I only have one small comment more. We can talk more in the question and answer. And that's, I like your concept of justice entrepreneurs. Although I wish you had included journalists among the justice entrepreneurs. I call those same people the pursuers. Obviously, I use more spectacular terminology when I can because I'm a journalist, but it's basically we're talking about the same thing. In the case of Operation Condor, as in the more general investigations of human rights violations in these countries at the time, you have an enormous and heroic, I think, group of people who from the very beginning began to gather information and data and documentation on all of these cases, not just Condor, but in general on human rights violations, even in the consciousness that nothing was going to happen until the dictatorships ended, that accountability and justice was not going to be possible until the end. But because they did this investigation, because they documented the cases, and of course here you have to include the FBI investigation. You have to include all of the work of the Vicaría de Solidaridad. I think the documentation in Argentina was much, much less at this time. You didn't have the systematic compilation of victim stories. But you have to include journalists like Monica Gonzalez, Horacio Verbitsky, and probably people like myself, who were, at the time, gathering information and compiling it. I mean, we were digging down into the sources of the people that were directly involved. So we were interviewing victims, something that the church organizations were also doing. We were talking to those the human rights activists and organizers, and we were translating this raw data into stories that kept the human rights story in the international press. But in some cases, and this I give Monica Gonzalez and Horacio Verbitsky. Horacio is an Argentine journalist, Monica is a Chilean journalist. They actually came up with incredibly important documentation of original correspondence of Operation Condor between the the Chilean representative living in Argentina and his superiors back in Santiago. These are the Arancibia Clavel papers, who were discovered by Horacio and Monica Gonzalez, and were used in that first Canicoba Corral trial that began in the late 1990s. So Operation Condor was both one of the most cruel examples of human rights violations, because there was it violated the possibility of having protection even if you have left your own country, even if you had gone into exile. But also it had that dimension of leading to the pursuit of justice, the successful pursuit of justice in many, many cases in this era.
Thank you very much, John. So let me open it up for Q&A, and Carlos is eagerly jumping off his seat, so please start, Carlos.
Yeah, one thing...
You have to also identify yourself, if you don't mind.
Carlos Osorio from the National Security Archive. Yeah, in line with what John said regarding how to identify the victim, I also would identify periods, because there is 1974 to 76, which is kind of pre-Condor. There is coordination that is not institutionalized yet. Then there is 1976, which is CIDE, and there is the institution. They put this down. They have a logo, and there is CIDE. There is the CIDE time, and there is this time from the JCR. They are going after JCR in full. And then there is the post, and actually 76 probably is the time when you have the most.
Yeah, right.
And then you have the post, which is 78, 79, 80s. And so I would put the times, and actually it's 601. That is different. The other thing that I would talk about too is that one thing that the trials don't make a distinction is that they are bilateral. There are many bilateral coordination that is not. They give the name Operation Condor as if the monster is always there. There is a forecast that it's a global coordination. It's not true. I mean, you have the Fusileros Navales from Uruguay with the Navy, and they are the ones that go against the GAO, for instance, in Uruguay in 1977. So I would make that nuance. And the other thing that is really cool is that John mentioned the importance of the classification of Chile. And in Argentina, in 2002, there is an upcoming classification. And you mentioned Argentina was the main operation center, operation area, and operation center also for Condor. And there is an upcoming big classification in a couple of months.
Thanks to you.
Share records. Share records are going to be classified.
Yeah.
CIA, DIA, and that is going to be a huge story.
Yeah.
Thank you, Carlos. So let's take a few questions, and then we'll let you have the last word. Anyone else have a comment or question? Yes, please identify yourself.
Ben Meyer, hired. Is there any intent to prosecute Americans who were involved in the
always a good question. Thank you. One more or two more questions? Yes, please.
My name is Sam Downing with the State Department. You mentioned the trials in several countries, but it seemed like Brazil was absent from your list. Wondering if you have a theory for why that is the case, given
Who's absent?
Brazil.
Oh, Brazil. Oh.
Despite all this talk right now about the strength of Brazil's judiciary and prosecutors to go after corruption, I'm wondering why they haven't been involved in this effort.
Great, thanks. Let's give Francesca a chance to respond to some of these questions.
Thank you very much. So on the journalists, definitely I want to add that category because of everything that you've been mentioning, and also I'm thinking of the work of Roger Rodriguez.
Oh, yes, absolutely, right. Yeah, I should have mentioned him.
Several of the clandestine flights back to Uruguay, and he was also one of the expert testimonies in Rome, so definitely, I'm sorry, my bad, I started typing the list, but of course it's never complete. And on the PVP, I'm sure we'll talk about this now, there was a military arm of the PVP, but I haven't established how much really of military actions they ever undertook. In my understanding, it was rather limited, and it was more of a political organization, but I'd be happy to hear other evidence that you may have on that. Of course, the work of the Vicaria, actually I was involved in a project with the Universidad Alberto Hurtado in Chile. They have a fantastic project looking at the entire archive of the Vicariate of Solidarity, and by collaborating with them, I managed to look at some of the some of the case files relating to Condor. So the amount of information that they have is amazing, and it was used by the court in Argentina whenever they were investigating cases of Chilean exiles persecuted by Condor in Argentina. The starting point was always the information by the Vicaria, because it's so rich and it was gathered close to the time when the crimes were committed, so it's just invaluable what they've done. In terms of the periods of the database, that's the next phase, but my statistical skills are extremely limited, so I'm going to rely on the help of a close friend and colleague, Lorena Ballardini, who is the statistical expert. So I've been talking to her about the database, and she was telling me exactly that we can do periodizations and see the frequencies of the kidnappings at different times. So hopefully I'll be presenting about that at some point next year once we've been able to go through. But I think it's really important to see the different, not only periods, but also the different countries that had a more predominant role or lesser predominant role within Condor at different times in between the mid or late 1970s. As you were saying, like towards the end, Argentina with Battalion 601, they have a large number of detentions of montoneros that were going back, trying to reach back Argentina as part of the counter. Yeah, exactly. Also, I'm also hopefully trying to include in the database the different detention centers and how many victims spend times at which center, to see also how Condor kind of moved across in that sense. And definitely what you say about the bilateral operations, I mean, although information circulated among the countries, in practice it was always the close bilateral coordination in carrying out the detention and the interrogation. And with the GAO is a very clear case, and it's actually one of the crucial cases in the trial in Rome, because basically Trócoli fled from Uruguay and went to Italy because of his grandfather's Italian ancestry, and so that's one of actually the crucial cases over there in Rome. So on the attempts to prosecute Americans, I don't know, I think they've tried, and actually I was monitoring the Operation Condor trial in Argentina for over a year and a half, and although there were of course no American defendants, I felt that the question of American responsibility or complicity within Operation Condor was always there, and actually one of the 4 judges was always sort of trying.
Yeah, he asked me. Yeah,
he asked
right.
you, so you can prove what I'm saying. That although of course there were no defendants there, but there was always the question of the economic support to all of these military regimes, but also the technological support, because many experts argue that the Condor encrypted system was something that was way beyond the resources available in the South American country, and that there must have been some form of support from the US in making that happen and enabling this kind of communication. So there haven't been any cases, but I think it's something that is always there, and I don't know if you know, John, of any cases, but it's definitely an issue on the table. And regarding Brazil, as far as I know, there hasn't been even a single criminal prosecution in Brazil, not just relating to Operation Condor, but even relating to crimes committed by the Brazilian dictatorship in Brazil. There has been a group of prosecutors that have tried over the years to file cases, but there is a very strong resistance and very strong support for the amnesty law in Brazil, which is used as the main sort of wall against prosecution. What I know has happened are some civil trials that exist in Brazil. They have a possibility of declaratory sentences, whereby civil courts have, and in some cases, I wouldn't say more than 10, such cases actually progress, and in some of them the courts basically declared, I remember the case of Brilhante Ustra, that was one of the well-known torturers in Brazil. The court have officially recognized that he was torturing political prisoners during the dictatorship on behalf of the state, but it only remains a sort of civil conviction, if we can say, because there was no criminal element to those kind of prosecutions. We shouldn't forget that Brazil also received a sentence in 2010 by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in the Gomes-Lund case, where the Inter-American Court told Brazil that the amnesty law shouldn't be an obstacle to prosecutions, but Brazil has so far failed to comply even with the sentence from the Inter-American Court. So I think it's quite interesting what you point out, because you can see sort of double standards, the judiciary being active in investigating some set of cases, but then leaving the human rights violations completely clouded in impunity.
Thank you for just.
So, can I?
Sure.
Yeah. I wanted to say something about impunity. This is another dimension to what we're talking about, but it's I think it's the underlying reason for what we're talking about for example, the fact that there's never been a trial for human rights violations in the United States. But not only in the United States, but the ability of courts to get at the truth of what happened in the Latin American countries has always been predominantly based on victims' testimony with a small amount of documentation from the governments themselves. And then, of course, there's the U.S. documents, the declassified documents, which are disproportionately represented as evidence in these trials. Those of us who work with these documents, we know how flimsy they are as evidence. And in fact, I'm shocked sometimes. I'm doing investigation of the Horman Taruji, the 2 Americans who were killed in Chile. U.S. documents are used in a totally incorrect way to prove things that there's no way those documents would be able to prove. They're just not that kind of evidence. But in the case of Condor, in other cases, human rights cases, for the lack of documentation from the countries themselves, from the military themselves, You rely on victims' testimony, and you rely on whatever you have. Why is that? These are all democracies. Why has no president in Latin America given direct orders to the military across the board to cooperate, even if they're retired officials or retired soldiers, at the risk of losing their pensions? In other words, why has there never been any pressure exerted from the highest level of the presidency on the military to actually cooperate? Not just to give cooperation in terms of nice statements of, you know, never again and we will help. In fact, we all know, those of us who have done any investigation, that the military has had a pact of silence, and that pact of silence has been respected by all of the governments in the region. Why has no government ever fired any military official because of failure to cooperate and failure to order his soldiers to cooperate? And so you have, I'm not saying that there aren't exceptions. There are a few exceptions, but across the board, you have had the governments have respected and allowed this pact of silence to go forward. And I think it's something that's not too late to remedy. In terms of the United States, I don't believe that the United States was directly complicitous in the murders of Operation Condor. I do know that there was contemporaneous information being conveyed from the military organizations, the Batallón 601, for example, in Argentina. I know of specific information that was conveyed from them to the CIA about people being detained in Orleti that was very close to the time of these people's detentions, probably in some cases even before the people had actually been killed. And while you can't say that the CIA, there is no evidence that I know of, and I always say it in that terms, I have no evidence that the CIA ever fingered anybody or said, go after these people, or provided lists of people to go after. I know that some writers think that occurred and therefore say that that occurred. In other words, going from wishing something's true to saying it is true is sometimes what happens in this kind of writing. But I'm very careful to say that complicity extends to foreknowledge, contemporaneous knowledge, and failure to do anything to prevent these, to prevent crimes that were underway at the time. Why that has never been examined in U.S. courts or in a systematic human rights investigation has always been, I think, a real laguna in terms of American human rights enforcement.
We have about 10 minutes for any additional comments or questions. You're going to have to wait.
John, you say you're going to plunder this research, and it's always been a refreshing openness about that. But,
well, we always credit.
Yeah, but you know, you have also mentioned that you are working on a revised version of Condor use. And I would be interested, you know, you can use gems or pearls as you wish, but I'd like to know what's changed. I'd like to know how about the history, not how it's been received by the courts or anything like that. You could take up the question of how did information generated through the court process actually affect the history. I mean, you know, that there were historical documents uncovered in that way. You mentioned also the theme that there are, of course, alternative accounts of Condor, some of which are highly unreliable on certain matters of evidence.
Yeah.
I'd just be interested in broad terms how you're thinking of revising. You know, other than saying, well, we know more now. Yeah, we
right.
don't know. But how would you characterize the sort of direction of the revisions or implications?
Well, I'm going to, number one, because it's now possible to do a systematic accounting of the victims and, of course, the trials. So I'm going to use that, and I think that's important to have in the book. I'm going to, this is a delicate area, but when I have seen interpretations of what happened that I think are not based on fact, I'm going to go into that, and I'm going to provide the evidence that shows that those interpretations are not correct to the extent that that's possible. That's a delicate area, but because you're always saying, somebody says, for example, there's one author who contends that the CIA identified victims, Condor victims, based on an account of an Uruguayan officer. Now, it's difficult for me to say that that officer didn't say what they said, that person who is not identified. I can't verify it. But I don't know who, so all I can say is there's no corroborating evidence elsewhere of the CIA having that kind of participation in the actual murders. And so you're always kind of proving a negative, right? You're saying something is asserted, but the evidence is not sufficient. But I think it's important to do that because there is so much assertion in this kind of literature that is not based on evidence, that at least what my obligation is as a journalist and an investigator is to point out where there is evidence and where there isn't evidence. So I don't know what your view on that is, but I see that's really important. So that's one of the important things I'm going to do in the book and in the new book. And I'm trying, and we should talk about this because I want to reinterpret Operation Condor or give a updated interpretation of its significance, because it has been much more important than I thought it was when I began my book. And, you know, it's gone way, originally I thought I was going to document the crimes. I was able to document the beginnings of the prosecutions, which I call the pursuit of justice, in the final actually the insistence of my editor, who said you can't just document the crimes. That's really a dark story. You have to show what happened because of this. And of course that was a really, really important story, which has grown in importance as time has gone on.
We have 2 hands right here.
My name is Maria. I'm from Chile.
Could you speak up? There's noise in here and I can't hear you.
I'm interested in you mentioned about Orlando Letier's assassination and how it opened up, it got the FBI's interest. Would you say it was, like, strategically speaking, a mistake on behalf of these allies, the dictators, to come and assassinate someone here? Because in the end, that actually made them be investigated. And on the other side, of course, but also a good thing for them to access that investigation for justice elsewhere.
Let's see, one last question.
Okay.
I'll let you guys have the final word.
Yes, Catherine Rabbit, I'm a researcher here in DC. I was wondering if you could speak, Francesca, a little bit about, you mentioned, this is a project looking for pathways to accountability. I wonder if in your interviews with victims, you have any idea of whether they consider these trials, convictions in absentia, et cetera, to be a success, if they consider that to be a remedy for what happened to them and their families, kind of how we deal with that issue of what is remedy in human rights prosecutions and how we get at that, either through judicial or non-judicial remedies.
Thank you.
You want to start?
Well, that's actually one of the things that I've been asking some victims, but also relatives of victims, what was their experience, first of giving testimony at the trial, and also the outcome of the trial. And of course, it's very subjective because everyone gives you a different response. But I think that in general, they perceive the opportunity to give testimony as a form of reparations for what they've suffered. And in many of the hearings that I listened to in the Operation Condor trial in Argentina, the witness would say that they were very thankful to the court for having them go to the court and give their testimony. And in some cases, it was actually the first time in 40 years that these families had the chance to tell the state, because the judiciary as a branch of the state was, after committing the crimes, they were taking the time to listen to the victims and their stories. And I also know the case of a Uruguayan mother that at 92 years old, she traveled all the way from Uruguay to Rome to give testimony, because that was basically the battle of her life, to try to identify, to find out what happened to her son. Of course, then, when the sentence was dictated in Rome last year and there were so many acquittals, the mood among the relatives and Uruguayan human rights activists was extremely low, because they had invested so much in this prosecution that to see 19 acquittals was extremely disappointing to them. So I think, if I had asked that same question close to the sentence being dictated, I would have received a very different response. But I think what's quite encouraging or inspiring is that now that the appeal is starting, everybody is again mobilizing and making newer efforts to gather any new evidence that may have appeared since then. So there always seems to be a continued activism despite some of the setbacks.
So, to your question, there's a simple answer to that, but which is yes. It was extremely counterproductive. It was probably the biggest mistake Pinochet made. He probably made it, we don't know his thinking, but we do know one of the new things that I will talk about in the book that we have documented, the kind of the biggest story that we didn't know at the time, we know now, is that the CIA determined with evidence that Pinochet gave the order to kill Letelier. We always assumed that, but assuming is never enough, at least not for me. And that he organized the cover-up and the campaign to prevent extradition of those who the FBI had identified and had indicted. That was Pinochet himself. The effect that the murder and then the known complicity of Pinochet himself personally had on U.S. policy over the years was significant, not determinative in every era, but certainly it meant the end of the alliance, the de facto alliance that had existed until 1976. During the Carter administration, of course, human rights was a priority again, and pressure was brought against the governments of the entire region, not just because of Operation Condor, of course, but the United States institutionally changed its attitude. You can see that in the documents. And the Letelier case keeps popping up and popping up. There will be, okay, are we going to do this or that with Argentina or Chile? Well, somebody will bring up, we have to take into account that they have resisted extradition, and the extradition requests are pending, and they have been stonewalling us on this, and so we can't normalize relations given the fact that that has happened. During the Reagan administration, there was a great deal of, there were many attempts to restore normal relations. In other words, to restore the alliance. Jeane Kirkpatrick, of course, was the leader of that. There was a lot of pushback against that, and eventually George Shultz in 1987 brought up again in the context of Chile's return to democracy, that the pressure to return to democracy was definitely not a foregone conclusion. he brought up again the evidence that Pinochet was responsible for the Letelier assassination. We knew none of that at the time. They never made this public, but it was an important factor in the decisions at the time. And of course, what the Reagan administration did, and then the Bush administration after him, was to exert tremendous pressure to ensure that Chile would return to democracy. I don't know the cases in the other countries as well, but I know the chapter and verse in the case of Chile. In terms of the acquittals, I just want to return to the people that are dissatisfied with the verdicts. In many cases, I sympathize with them because I think the acquittals probably a judge made the best judgment they could make, and they probably determined these people could not be convicted based on the evidence. Why don't they have the specific evidence of the specific operations by specific units of the military that led to the deaths of all these people? There is an answer to that question, and that is that the military has refused to provide the documentation. Anybody who has ever done any research in military operations knows that everything is documented in the military. Every time a car leaves from a military base with soldiers in that car, in that truck, though what happens is in the logs, the names are there, the leadership is there, the orders are there, the objectives are there, and the results are documented. All of that information exists. None of it has been provided. That's the stuff that would specifically lead to convictions of individual military officers. So that's where we have to leave it, I guess.
Well, please join me in thanking Francesca Lessa and for the fantastic presentations and the conversation that we've had here today. I just want to note that in this room, I see the faces of dozens of human rights or justice entrepreneurs. I see Frank LaRue in the background, who is a very well-known human rights activist from Guatemala. I see Ann Schneider, who works in the U.S. government, helping us identify war criminals living amongst us and sending them back to their home countries. Carlos, of course, who's been documenting and helping us understand the repression in South America using U.S. government declassified documents. And there's a whole bunch of you. And then there's a lot of us who are researchers, Alex, Ann, Francesca, and myself, Chris. So the web of human rights and justice entrepreneurs is vast. And I want to thank all of us for our work and all of you for coming today. Thank you.